Imagine walking outside right now, and instead of seeing trees, you're looking up at mushrooms that are taller than your house. I'm talking about fungal towers that make some trees look like houseplants. And here's the thing, this isn't fiction. This actually happened for 50 million years before trees even existed. Earth was basically ruled by giant mushrooms. And honestly, if plants hadn't shown up when they did, we'd probably still be living in a world where the tallest things around are fungus pillars that could crush your car. Now, here's where things get properly weird. We're talking about Earth around 400 million years ago. And let me tell you, you think your morning commute is depressing? Try walking around back then. You know how people complain about urban sprawl ruining nature? Well, congratulations. You would have loved the Devonian period because there was basically nothing to ruin. Picture this. You're standing on what will eventually become, I don't know, Ohio or something. Except there are no trees. None. Not a single one. There's no grass either. No flowers, no bushes, no hedges your neighbor can passively aggressively trim to spite you. The tallest plants you'd see would maybe come up to your ankle if they were having a really good day. Most of them looked less impressive than the weeds growing through sidewalk cracks. It's mostly just rocks and dirt. And not even good dirt. We're talking about soil that was basically in beta testing mode. Plants hadn't figured out how to properly die and rot into nice compost yet. So the earth was this weird mix of sand, clay, and whatever passed for organic matter when there wasn't much organic matter to go around. You know how your car windows fog up when it's humid? Now imagine that, but everywhere, all the time. The atmosphere had about 10 times more carbon dioxide than today. 10 times. The entire planet was basically one big greenhouse that somebody forgot to ventilate. You would step outside and immediately feel like you were breathing soup. Walking around this place would have been genuinely unsettling. You could hike for days and not see anything taller than your knees. Just endless stretches of bare rock and these pathetic little green stubs poking up here and there. The biggest wildlife you would have encountered would be things crawling around on the ground, and when I say crawling, I mean it. We're talking about millipedes, some early insects that hadn't figured out flying yet, and maybe some scorpions if you were really unlucky. The most exciting animal encounter you might have would be stepping on something crunchy and hoping it wasn't poisonous. No mammals, no reptiles, no amphibians even. Those guys were still figuring out how to exist. The most advanced animals were basically things that looked like they should be living under a log in your backyard, except they were the apex predators of their time, which tells you something about how low the bar was set. The weather was hot too, and not just summer hot, but tropical greenhouse hot all year round, and humid, the kind of humidity where your clothes stick to you and you start questioning your life choices, except you couldn't even question your life choices because complex thought hadn't really been invented yet. Rivers and lakes were around, sure, but they were warm, like bathwater that's been sitting too long. Instead of fish, you might see some early jawless things swimming around that looked like they were designed by someone who had never seen a fish before and then described it to someone that was drunk. The landscape had this eerie quality where everything seemed empty. You know that feeling when you're in a big empty parking lot at night? Except imagine that feeling, but it's just the entire planet. And it's not night, it's just perpetually misty and weird. There were no forests to get lost in, no meadows to frolic through, no mountains covered in trees, just these bizarre flat expanses with tiny green dots scattered around the occasional puddle. If you were feeling adventurous, you might find some moss. Exciting stuff. And the silence. Without birds or large animals, the loudest sounds would have been wind and maybe some water moving around, and the occasional scuttle of something small trying not to become lunch for something else small. It was quiet in that unsettling way that makes you realize how much noise living things usually make. But here's the thing about this seemingly empty, hostile, and frankly boring landscape. Something was growing here that would have made you question everything you thought you knew about how life works. And what was slowly growing here was about to be absolutely massive. Meet Prototaxites. Yes, that's a real name. Some scientists back in the day decided to give this thing a name that sounds like a tax software, but whatever. These were the giants I was talking about. And when I say giants, I mean it in the most ridiculous way possible. 26 feet tall. That is taller than most homes. That's wider than your dining room table, just sitting there in the middle of nowhere, being a mushroom for 50 million years. That's almost as long than mammals have been the dominant thing on Earth. These fungus towers were just chilling, doing their mushroom thing, while the rest of life was still figuring out how to not be microscopic. microscopic. But here's the fun part. Scientists found these fossils and had absolutely no clue what they were looking at. For over a century, they were completely stumped. Some thought they were trees, others thought maybe some weird type of seaweed that got really lost. A few suggested they might be giant lichens, which is just fungi with commitment issues anyway. But the fossils looked like big, thick stone tree trunks, which is confusing because they were finding them in rocks from way before trees existed. It's like finding a gun in a medieval castle. Something's not adding up here. Scientists kept arguing about this for decades. Team tree versus team seaweed versus team we have no idea what this is. Meanwhile, these fossil things are just sitting in museums, being tall and mysterious and probably judging everyone for their terrible guesses. Then, in the 2000s, someone finally had the bright idea to actually test the chemistry of these fossils. Revolutionary stuff. Turns out when you apply science to scientific mysteries, you sometimes get scientific answers. The chemical signature was pure fungus. Not plant, not animal, not some weird alien thing, but just fungus that decided to get really big. So Prototaxites was essentially a mushroom that thought it was a redwood, except it existed hundreds of millions of years before redwoods were even a glimmer in evolution's eye. These things were pioneers, the original big boys on the block. And they weren't just tall, they were thick. Over 3 feet across in some cases. Imagine walking through that barren landscape I just described and coming across what looks like a telephone pole made of mushroom, just standing there doing nothing, being weird. It literally feels like something you would see in like an analog horror series on YouTube. The structure was also pure fungus too, because you might think, well, what if it's just fungus growing on something? Nope. When scientists looked at thin slices under microscopes, they saw the classic fungal tubes all woven together. No wood, no bark, no growth rings, just fungus architecture that somehow managed to stay upright for years without falling over, which is more than I can say for most of my houseplants, because honestly, those things are dead. I should be charged with a hate crime for how I take care of plants. These things had the whole planet to themselves. Fossils have been found everywhere. North America, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, wherever conditions were right, up popped a giant mushroom tower. And they lived forever. Well, not forever, but a really long time for something that's basically a mushroom. Individual towers could grow for years, just adding layer after layer of fungus until they reached their full ridiculous height. Some probably stood in the same spot for decades, watching tiny arthropods crawl around their base and thinking whatever mushrooms think about. Fungus has always like freaked me out because what do you mean it's not a plant and it's not an animal? Does it think? What does it do? There's a zombie fungus that turns ants into zombies, so like it's just a terrifying concept. The underground part of these fungi was even more impressive. These visible towers were just tip. Underneath, they had these massive fungal networks spreading out through the soil, kind of like the internet, except it was made of mushroom threads, and probably they were a lot nicer to each other. They could tap into nutrients from large areas. While those pathetic ankle-high plants were struggling to find enough food to stay alive, Prototaxites had an entire underground empire supplying the main towers. It was the original gig economy, except instead of driving people around, fungal threads were driving nutrients around. For 50 million years, if you wanted to see something tall, you looked at Prototaxites. They were the skyscrapers of their time, the landmarks, the things you would use to navigate. Yeah, just go past the giant mushroom tower, then hang a left at the other giant mushroom tower. But being tall was just the beginning of their tricks. So how did a mushroom become Earth's first skyscraper for millions of years? Turns out, Prototaxites had figured out the ultimate life hack. While every other living thing was desperately trying to catch some sunlight and grow leaves and do all that photosynthesis nonsense, these guys just said, nah, we're good, and went a completely different route. They didn't need sunlight at all. They had zero dependence on that big yellow thing in the sky. Instead, they just ate dead stuff, rotting plant matter, decomposing algae, whatever organic garbage was lying around. This gave them an insane advantage. Every plant on Earth had to fight for sun exposure, and they had to worry about getting shaded out, and had to complete for the perfect spot with good lighting. Prototaxites, though, they could set up shop anywhere there was dirt and dead things, which in a world where everything kept dying because life was still figuring itself out, was pretty much everywhere. The underground game was where they really dominated though. Remember those fungal networks I just mentioned? Well, those networks could spread for miles. One prototaxite might have fungal threads reaching out in every direction, tapping into food sources that were completely out of reach for those tiny surface plants. While a little moss patch was struggling to find enough nutrients in its immediate area, prototaxites were pulling resources from an area the size of a small town. And here's where it gets really unfair for everything else. Those underground networks didn't just find food, they hoarded it. They could store nutrients for bad times, kind of like having a huge underground pantry. When conditions got tough and other organisms started dying off, prototaxites would just dip into its reserves and keep growing. They were also really good at playing the long game. Most early plants lived fast and died young because life was harsh, but prototaxites could just sit there for decades, slowly growing taller and thicker, building up its strength while everything around it struggled to survive another season. In competition? What competition? The tallest plants were maybe around 2 feet high on their best day. That is not competition. That's barely even noticeable. Prototaxites had the vertical space all for themselves. No one was fighting them for the top spot because no one else could even reach the bottom of the top spot. They spread across the entire planet too. And I literally mean the entire planet. Scientists have found prototaxite fossils on pretty much every single continent. These things had better global coverage than most Walmarts do. Wherever there was land that wasn't completely underwater or completely on fire, there was probably a giant mushroom tower. Just like now, there's a Walmart parking lot. The spread wasn't random either. They were smart about it. Well, as smart as a fungus can be. They grew tall specifically to launch their spores higher into the air. The taller you are, the farther your spores can travel on the wind. And those spores were everywhere. The air back then was probably thick with prototaxite spores just floating around looking for new places to set up shop. Any patch of ground with decent organic matter could potentially become home to a new fungal tower. They had colonized the planet more thoroughly than humans have, and they did it 400 million years before humans even existed. The climate helped them too. All that heat and humidity I mentioned earlier, it was perfect fungus weather. While other organisms were struggling with extreme conditions, prototaxites was thriving. Hot and humid is exactly what fungi love. They were living their best life while everything else was just trying not to die. Plus, nothing was eating them. There were no herbivores back then. No animals big enough or interested enough to take a bite out of a giant mushroom tower. The biggest threat to prototaxite was maybe some tiny bug burrowing a hole in it, which is about as dangerous as a mosquito bite to a person. They could just grow around the damage and keep going. They had no natural predators, unlimited food sources, perfect growing conditions, and zero competition for their ecological niche. They had basically won the evolutionary lottery and then kept winning it for 50 billion years straight. The soil itself started working for them too. As prototaxites broke down organic matter and died and regrew, they were actually creating better soil conditions. The ground around established fungal towers became richer and more fertile, which attracted more dead plant matter, which fed the fungus, which made the soil even better. They had basically created their own positive feedback loop. By the time other organisms started figuring out how to grow taller, prototaxites had already established itself everywhere worth establishing. They had first mover advantage on a planetary scale. Every good spot was already taken by a giant mushroom that had been there longer than entire species have existed. For 50 million years, this strategy was unbeatable. Nothing could touch them. And it turns out that being untouchable made them ecosystem architects. And what do I mean by that? Well, you might think that these giant mushroom towers just stood there doing nothing except growing. Wrong. Dead wrong. These things were basically ancient apartment buildings, except instead of noisy neighbors and broken elevators, they had bugs living inside them. Lots and lots of bugs. Scientists found fossil evidence of tiny tunnels all through prototaxite trunks, little boreholes where early insects had moved in and made themselves at home. And I'm not talking about a few holes here and there. Some fossils are absolutely riddled with these tunnels. It looked like Swiss cheese. You know, if Swiss cheese was made of mushroom and also 26 feet tall. These weren't random holes either. They were organized, planned out. The bugs that made them knew what they were doing. They'd carve out little hallways and chambers inside the fungus, creating their own tiny neighborhoods. And the best part, it just grew around the holes and kept going. Imagine being a millipede back then. Your housing options were basically under a rock or inside a giant mushroom. It's not really a tough choice. The mushroom had climate control, protection predators, and room service in the form of edible walls. Imagine if you could eat the walls of your house. Literally, you could live forever. These bugs had figured out luxury living 400 million years before humans even invented hotels. The fungus didn't seem to mind the company either. In fact, some scientists think it might have actually helped. The bugs are basically doing maintenance work, cleaning out dead tissue and keeping air flowing through the structure. Outside the towers, things got interesting too. A 26-foot tall mushroom casts a pretty decent shadow, and in a world where everything else was getting fried by constant sunlight, that shadow was prime real estate. Tiny plants and mosses could actually survive in the shade of these giants. They created these little pockets of slightly less terrible living conditions. The humidity was different around them too. All that fungal activity was pumping moisture into the air, creating mini weather systems. If you were a small creature trying not to dry out in that prehistoric greenhouse climate, hanging around Prototaxites was probably your best bet. And when these towers finally died and fell over, well, that was when the real party started. A dead Prototaxite was essentially a 26-foot long buffet for every decomposer in that area. Bacteria, smaller fungi, insects, whatever passed for scavengers back then. They all showed up for the feast. These fallen giants would take years to fully break down, and during that time, they were bustling with life. Different creatures would specialize in different parts of the decay process. Some would eat the fresh fungal tissue, others would wait for it to get a little ripe. The really patient ones would hang around for the final stages when everything was nice and rotten. This whole death and decay process was also building soil. Remember how I mentioned the ground back then was basically dirt and beta testing? Well, Prototaxites was also doing the debugging. Every time one of these giants lived and died, it was adding organic matter to the ground, making it richer and more fertile. The fungal networks underground were busy too. They weren't just feeding the main tower, they were trading nutrients with smaller fungi and probably some of those tiny plants. It was basically the world's farmer's market. Some researchers think Prototaxites might have even had partnerships with algae or early plants growing on their surfaces. It's not confirmed, but imagine a giant mushroom covered in a thin layer of green stuff. It would have looked even weirder than normal, which is saying something. And the strangest part about this whole ecosystem was temporary. Every Prototaxite eventually died, taking its little community with it. But then new spores would spread and new towers would pop up somewhere else, and the whole cycle would start over. So for millions of years, wherever you found Prototaxites, you found life. Real, thriving, bustling life in an otherwise pretty empty world. They weren't just surviving, they were creating conditions for other things to survive too. But their good times were about to end permanently because everything changed when the plants figured out how to get tall. For 50 million years, Prototaxites had owned the height game. Nothing even came close. And suddenly, plants decided they were done being ankle high and started reaching for the sky. And when I say suddenly, I mean suddenly in geological terms, which is still millions of years, but whatever. The first real threat showed up in the form of Archaeopteryx. This thing wasn't messing around. It grew over 30 feet tall, had actual wood, real roots, and honest-to-God leaves. It wasn't those pathetic little stem things that had been passing for plants before. It had full, big leaves, lots of them. Archaeopteryx was everything Prototaxites wasn't. Fast-growing, light-loving, and absolutely ruthless when taking up space. Where Prototaxites would take decades to reach full height, these new trees could shoot up in just a few years. They were the overachievers that made everyone else look bad. But speed wasn't the only problem. These trees brought friends. Lots of friends. Once one type of plant figured out how to grow tall, suddenly every plant wanted in on the action. Ferns started growing taller, seed plants showed up, and before you knew it, there were actual forests popping up all over the place. Forests, real ones, with canopies and understories and all that complicated stuff that makes a forest a forest. And these weren't just collections of tall plants standing around looking impressive, they were ecosystems. Complex, interconnected, nutrient-hogging ecosystems that changed everything. The underground war was brutal. Tree roots were aggressive. They didn't just sit there politely sharing nutrients with the local fungal networks. They actively competed. They formed partnerships with smaller fungi that helped them grab even more resources. They basically turned turned the soil into their personal territory. And remember those extensive underground networks that had made prototaxites so dominant? Well, suddenly they had competition, real competition. Tree roots could go deeper, spread wider, and work faster than fungal threads. The trees were winning the resource game, and they were winning decisively. Above ground wasn't any better. Those massive canopies blocked out huge amounts of sunlight. Now, prototaxites didn't need sunlight for energy, but a lot of the small plants and algae it fed on did need sunlight. When the forests moved in, the food sources started disappearing. The decomposing organic matter that had sustained giant fungi for millions of years was suddenly in short supply. The climate started changing too. All of those trees were pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and pumping out oxygen. The hot, human greenhouse conditions that prototaxites loved were cooling down. The world was becoming cooler, more seasonal, and less fungus friendly. And then there were the fires. Forests burn. It's what they do. Lightning hits, things get dry, and suddenly you've got wildfires racing across the landscape. Prototaxites, with their slow growth and years of investment in each tower, couldn't handle that kind of disturbance. Fire that a tree could recover from in a few years would wipe out decades of fungal growth. The new ecosystems brought new animals too. More insects, early amphibians, and eventually things that actually ate plants. Herbivores. The concept of something actively munching on living vegetation was brand new, and it was bad news for anything that couldn't defend itself or grow back quickly. Prototaxites had evolved in a world where nothing ate them. Now there were creatures starting to figure out that organic matter didn't have to be dead to be food. Some of these early plant eaters probably took experimental bites out of fungal towers, and unlike the tiny boring insects that prototaxites could grow around, bigger herbivores could do real damage. The writing was on the wall. Actually, the writing was in the fossil record. Starting around 370 million years ago, prototaxites fossils became rarer and rarer. The giants that had dominated every landscape on Earth were losing ground everywhere. Competition for prime real estate got fierce. The swampy, nutrient-rich areas where prototaxites had always thrived were now the exact same place trees wanted to grow, and trees were better at claiming territory and keeping it. They could grow faster, spread their influence wider, and once established, they were much harder to dislodge. The final nail in the coffin was probably the forests themselves becoming self-sustaining. Once you had enough trees in one place, they started creating their own weather patterns, their own soil conditions, their own everything. They didn't need the outside world anymore. They had become the outside world. By the end of the Devonian period, around 360 million years ago, prototaxite fossils completely disappeared from the geological record. After 50 million years of unchallenged dominance, the giant fungi were gone. Not just rare, not just reduced to smaller sizes, but gone. The age of forest had begun, and there was no room left for 26-foot tall mushrooms. The trees had won the height war, the resource war, and ultimately the evolutionary war. Game over. But their defeat, though, gave us the world we know today. Prototaxites losing was the best thing that could have ever happened for the human species. Think about it. If those giant mushrooms had won their war with the trees, Earth would still be covered in fungal towers today. No forests means no diverse ecosystems. No diverse ecosystems means no complex animal evolution. No complex animal evolution means you're not watching this video because humans never happened. We exist only because a mushroom failed. The soil under your feet right now, prototaxites helped build that. All that organic matter they pumped into the ground for 50 million years created the foundation that trees needed to grow. They basically prepared the earth for their own replacement. It's the most accidental genius thing in evolutionary history. Those forests that wiped them out became the ecosystems that supported the first amphibians crawling onto land. Those amphibians became reptiles. Reptiles became dinosaurs and mammals. Mammals eventually became us. The entire chain of events that led to complex life on Earth started when trees figured out how to kill giant mushrooms. Fungi didn't disappear, they just got smarter about it. Today, the largest living organism on the planet is still a fungus. The honey fungus in Oregon covers over 2,000 acres underground. It's massive, it's just invisible. Modern fungi learned the lesson prototaxites never did. Stay hidden, stay small above ground, and dominate from below. Every forest you've ever walked through is secretly run by fungal networks. They connect tree roots, trade nutrients, and basically operate the internet of the woods. Prototaxites was doing all of this 400 million years ago. They just made the mistake of being obvious about it. And the really wild part, We almost lived in the mushroom timeline. If plants had evolved differently, if the climate hadn't changed just right, if any number of tiny factors had gone another way, giant fungi might still rule the world. You could be looking up at 30-foot mushroom towers instead of oak trees right now. But they lost, and their loss gave us everything. The forest that produces our oxygen, the coal deposits we dig up for energy, the diverse landscapes that make Earth interesting instead of just weird. All of it traces back to the moment when plants finally grew tall enough to cast shadows on the world's first skyscrapers. Prototaxites ruled Earth longer than humans have even existed as a species. 50 million years of unchallenged dominance. And all it took was some plants figuring out wood to end their entire empire. Evolution doesn't care about your track record, it just cares about progress. The age of mushroom towers was finally over. The age of everything else began when they fell. It makes you think though, what will happen after the age of humans are over? Are we just setting the Earth up for the next dominant species? Well, if you look at the history of evolution, it would suggest so. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more videos about prehistory, dinosaurs, and all that sort of stuff. And if you want to watch another one of my videos, you should click the video on screen now.